Wyoming Territory, 1882. The wind blew dry and sharp through the dusty town of Rawlins as Marshal Micah Alder stepped off the boardwalk and paused near the depot, his eyes catching on something that made his boots stop cold. She was sitting alone on the bench beneath the depot's awning, a battered carpet bag at her feet, and a worn blue shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. She looked like she had been sitting there longer than anyone ought to, her hands wrapped around each other in her lap like they were the only solid thing keeping her upright. Micah had seen the look before on men after battles, on widows after telegrams, but never quite like this. Never with eyes like hers wide and wary but holding firm, like she was bracing herself to keep breathing no matter what the world threw her way. He cleared his throat as he stepped closer. "Miss, you waiting on someone?" She startled, straightened. "No, sir." Not anymore. Up close, she was younger than he'd guessed, maybe 23, 24. Her face bore the faint smudge of travel dust, but her voice was steady. "You been sitting here a while." She nodded once. "Train came through this morning, I got off." That was the end of my ticket. Micah looked down the tracks. No more trains until tomorrow, maybe not even then with the weather rolling in from the north. He looked back at her. "You got somewhere to go?" "No," she swallowed, looking away like the truth came with a sting. "Not anymore." He waited a beat, then held out his hand. "Micah Alder, I run the marshal's office in town." She sized him up for a second, long enough for him to feel it, then slowly reached out. "Tessa Albright." "All right, Miss Albright, it's gonna get cold tonight. You should not stay out here." "There is an extra room at my place. It is nothing fancy, but it is warm. You can rest, get your bearings, nothing expected in return." She looked at him, long and quiet. Then she nodded. "All right." They walked side by side through the town, his long strides slowing without thinking, her steps steady but quiet. She did not say much, and neither did he. They passed the saloon, the mercantile, the livery. People nodded, some stared. Tessa kept her chin up. Micah's place sat just beyond the edge of town, a small cabin with a lean-to stable and a porch that creaked in the wind. He opened the door for her. She stepped inside and stood still a moment, taking it in. The fire was still burning in the stove from that morning. A kettle sat on the back burner. The place was neat, if plain, bed against the far wall, table and chairs in the middle, a shelf of books and a rifle resting in the corner. "You can take the bed," Micah said, pulling off his coat. "I'll take the chair tonight." "I do not need you do," he said gently. "And it is all right." She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Thank you." He handed her a blanket and stepped outside to give her space. The air was colder now and the sky was darkening. He leaned against the porch post, watching the horizon, trying to figure out what to make of the woman who had just walked into his life with nothing but a carpet bag and a stare that had gone too still. Inside, she moved quietly. When he came back in, she had folded her shawl on the end of the bed and was sitting at the table. Her hands were still clasped, but her eyes were softer. He poured them both coffee. She took hers with both hands, like the warmth meant more than the taste. "I had a brother in Cheyenne," she said after a long silence. "He told me to come, said he had work and a place for me. I got here and found out he died last week. Pneumonia took him." "I am sorry," Micah said. She nodded. "You're the only one who has said that." They sat quiet again. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind picked up. "You got family?" she asked. "No one left," he said. "Used to have a little brother, lost him in the war. Parents died before that." Her gaze met his, then steady, unflinching. "You know what it is to lose everything." "I do." And there it was again, that look in her eyes, not just pain, not just fear, something else. Something strong beneath all of it, like a promise she had made to herself long ago. He could see it, and somehow it settled something in him. "Tomorrow," he said, I can help you look for work if that is what you want, or if you just need time first, that is all right too." She gave a soft smile then. "The first one." "Thank you, Marshal Alder." "Micah," he said. "Micah," she repeated, and it sounded like something real on her tongue. The next morning she was still there. He thought maybe she would be gone, but when he stepped out of his room she was standing by the stove, stirring the kettle, wrapped in one of his old shirts. Her hair was down, and the early light caught the gold in it. "You do not mind coffee for breakfast?" she asked. He smiled. "Not one bit." They ate together, and when she looked at him across the table there was something easier in her face, not quite joy, but peace maybe, a beginning. Later that day, he took her into town and helped her speak to the widow who ran the laundry. Tessa got hired on the spot. She worked hard, said little, but every time Micah came by, she looked up. One afternoon, a week later, he found her walking back toward the cabin. The wind had picked up again and her cheeks were pink from the cold. She smiled when she saw him. "You walk all this way?" he asked. "Feels good to move," she said. "To be doing something." They walked together, not saying much until they reached the porch. He paused and she did too. "Micah," she said softly, "you did not have to help me, I know," he said. "But I wanted to." She reached out then, fingers brushing his sleeve, not much, just enough, and he saw it again, that promise in her eyes. Except this time it was not just to survive, it was to stay. The March thaw came slow to Rawlins, the snow receding in patches that left behind sodden earth and the smell of cold mud. Tessa stood outside the laundry house after her shift, sleeves rolled up to her elbows, fingers chapped from lye and steam. Her arms ached, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that came from having done something that mattered, even if just for herself. Micah leaned against the hitching post across the street, arms folded, watching as she wrung out the last cloth and hung it over the line stretched between the two posts behind the building. He hadn't planned to wait, not exactly, but his boots had carried him there anyway. She glanced up and caught him looking. "You always stand like that?" she asked, wiping her hands on her skirt as she approached. "Like you're guarding something important." He stepped forward, nodding toward the clothespins she still held. "Might be I am." She raised a brow, but her tone stayed light. "What are you guarding? The firewood pile? Or that old mule you keep behind the livery?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head toward the open stretch of land beyond the churchyard, where the sun was falling behind the ridge. "You feel like walking a while," she nodded, and they left the town behind, boots whispering across thawing grass and patches of gravel. The wind was calmer than the day before, and the air held a damp kind of hush, like the world was waiting for something to bloom. After a while, she glanced sideways. "I used to walk like this with my mother. She liked the quiet, said it helped her sort her thoughts." "You favor her?" he asked. "Some," she said. "She had a sharper mouth than I do, but she knew when to hold it too." Micah didn't press. He let her lead the silence this time. When she stopped near a low hill where the prairie opened wide, she knelt and brushed her hand over the brittle remains of last year's sage. "She used to dry this and hang it near the stove," she said. "Said it smelled like memory." He crouched beside her, watching her fingers move through the brush. "Most folks just burn it to keep flies off." She wasn't most folks. They sat there a long while, the wind shifting the hem of her skirt. When she finally stood, she held a small bundle in her hand, bound with a strip torn from her apron. "For your stove," she said, holding it out. He took it carefully, not looking away from her. They walked back slower, dusk catching in the folds of the land. As they neared the cabin, Tessa paused and looked toward the old corral behind the stable. "You ever ride anymore?" she asked. "Not unless I have to," he said. "Most of the time I stay close. Town's quiet, but not quiet enough to leave for long." She watched the sway of the empty gate. "My father raised horses. Nothing fancy, just good stock. He said a horse could tell more about a person than words ever would." Micah nodded. "That's true." She turned to him, her face unreadable in the fading light. "What would yours say about you?" He slipped his hands into his pockets, shoulders easing just a little. "That I take my time. And I don't run unless I mean to finish the race." Tessa gave a quiet laugh, low and almost surprised. "That sounds like the horse I like best. She was stubborn, wouldn't move for anyone but me." They reached the porch, and he opened the door for her. She stepped inside, her boots leaving a faint trail across the plank floor. He followed, setting the sage bundle on the shelf above the stove. She lingered near the table, her fingers brushing the edge of the wood. "I've been thinking," she said, "about staying. For good." He looked up from where he was stoking the fire. "You sure?" She met his eyes. "If I leave, I have to start over again, somewhere I don't know. Here I've got work and you." Micah straightened slowly. "You've got me." "I think so," she said softly. "If I'm not wrong." He stepped toward her, slow and certain. "You're not wrong." She didn't move until he was close enough to touch. Then she reached up, not to draw him in, but just to rest her hand against his chest, where the warmth of the fire had started to settle into the fabric. "I don't want to be a burden," she said. "You're not," he said. "You're a beginning." He saw it again, that flicker behind her eyes. Not just hope this time. Trust. She leaned into him, and he let his hand settle gently at her back. Outside, the wind had quieted. And inside, the silence held steady, not empty, but full of something growing. The sun was still low when Micah noticed the frost had finally slipped away from the windows. Early light filtered through the lace-curtained panes, catching on the steam rising from the stovetop. He'd woken to the smell of cornmeal frying and the hushed clatter of a pan being set down with care. It wasn't the first time Tessa had taken to the stove in the morning, but today there was something different in the rhythm of her movements, less cautious, more rooted. He stepped into the main room, pulling his suspenders over his shoulders as he crossed to the table. Tessa looked up, her sleeves rolled to her forearms, hair still damp from where she'd tucked it behind her ears. "Hope you like it crisp," she said, nodding toward the cakes on the plate. "I like it however it comes," he replied, taking a seat. She poured him coffee, then sat across from him. For a few minutes they ate in quiet, the kind that had settled between them lately, not heavy, not strained, but full of held breath, waiting to see what came next. Tessa broke the silence first. "The widow's husband, Mrs. Kendry, he used to carve toys out of leftover firewood. She showed me one yesterday. Said he made it in the weeks after the war ended. A little horse, no bigger than your hand." Micah nodded slowly, wiping crumbs from his beard. "Lot of men needed something to do with their hands after the war." She said he barely spoke for months, just carved. He glanced toward the window where the light was warming to gold. Carving's quiet work gave him something to shape, maybe. Tessa's gaze lingered on the table. "I think I understand that. I've been sewing nights after work, just scraps, but it helps." He watched her fingers, how they rested lightly on the rim of her cup. "What are you making?" "A quilt," she said. "Not for anything, just to keep busy." Micah leaned back in his chair. "Might be it's for more than that." She glanced at him, then away. "Maybe." Later that day, he found her behind the cabin, crouched by the fence he'd been meaning to mend since last summer. She had a length of twine in one hand and was threading it through a split post, her brow furrowed like she meant to get it right the first time. "You planning to take my job?" he asked, leaning on the rail beside her. She didn't look up. "If you'd gotten to it first, I wouldn't have to," he chuckled. "Fair enough." They worked side by side for the next hour, the rhythm of it easy. Micah held the boards while she tied them off, her knots careful and tight. When they stepped back to admire the patchwork, she dusted her hands and looked up at him. "You ever think of leaving Rawlins?" He shook his head. "Not since I came here." "Why not?" Micah studied the horizon. "Place like this, it's slow, but it's steady. I needed that. After everything, I couldn't stomach the noise of a big town." She nodded, then asked, "And before?" His jaw tightened slightly. "Before, I thought I'd end up in Kansas. My brother wanted a homestead there. We had a plan, but plans don't always outlive people." Tessa didn't press. She just watched the wind move across the grass, then said, "I never thought I'd end up in Wyoming." He turned to her. "You regret it?" "No," she said. "Not anymore." That night after supper, they sat by the hearth. Tessa had her sewing in her lap, piecing together small triangles of calico. Micah was oiling the hinges on his rifle, the smell of gunmetal mixing with the faint scent of wood smoke. "Mrs. Kendry offered me more hours," Tessa said, eyes on her stitching. "Said I've got a good hand for folding." He set the cloth down beside the rifle. "You thinking of taking them?" I told her I'd think on it. "I don't mind the work, but I was wondering about something else." Micah waited. "She said there's a schoolteacher position opening come fall. The last one's leaving to marry a cattleman near Laramie. I was thinking, if I stayed, maybe I could write to the board." He nodded. "You'd be good at it." "I don't have a teaching certificate," she said, voice low, "but I can read clean, write proper, and I remember enough numbers to keep a class straight." "You'd still need to pass an assessment," he said. "But I know folks on the board. I could speak for you." She looked up at that, her eyes meeting his. "Would you?" "I would." The room softened between them, the fire casting long shadows on the walls. She set her quilting aside and stood, stepping toward the window. Her reflection flickered in the glass, tired but steady. "I never thought I'd start over somewhere that didn't know me, and now, it's strange to want it." Micah rose, crossing the room to stand beside her. "It's not strange, it's just brave." She turned slowly and looked up at him. "You make it easier." He didn't say anything, but he reached for her hand. She let him take it. Outside, the stars were beginning to show one by one across the quiet Wyoming sky. Inside, their hands stayed joined, warm in the hush between words. By late April, the land had softened enough for planting. Micah stood beside the kitchen window, watching as Tessa stepped carefully between rows of tilled soil behind the cabin, a small sack of onion sets tucked under her arm. Her dress hem was damp with earth, and her boots left neat prints in the loam. He hadn't asked her to help with the garden, it had been hers to start. She'd come home from the mercantile one afternoon with a folded paper of seeds and a look that said the decision had already been made. He grabbed his hat from the peg and stepped outside. The sun hit his shoulders with the first genuine warmth of the season, and the air held a faint green edge, like the world was remembering how to grow again. "You're spacing those tighter than I do," he said, nodding toward the furrow. "I read it keeps weeds down," she replied without looking up, "and I like things neat." He crouched beside her and took a handful of soil. "This ground's seen more dust than rain the last few years. Might not grow as clean as you'd like." "I'm not expecting perfect," she said. "Just something worth the work." Her fingers moved with quiet certainty, pressing each bulb into the earth and covering it with a palmful of dirt. She worked with a pace that made sense to Micah, not hurried, not slow, just steady. "Mrs. Kendry asked me to come by Sunday afternoon," she said. "She's got old lesson books from the last teacher. Said I could borrow them. You thinking of starting early? I want to know what I'm walking into. I've never taught a room full of children. I figure books might be easier to face first." Micah dusted his hands on his trousers. "There's a boy down by the stockyards, Tommy Weller. 9 years old, sharp as they come, but his ma says he won't sit still in church, let alone a classroom." "I'll bring licorice root," she said. "Bribery's older than arithmetic." He laughed, and she looked up. Her hands stilled, and for a moment they just watched one another. "You ever think about having children?" she asked. Micah's gaze drifted toward the ridge line. "I used to. Before the war, my brother and I talked about building homes beside each other. Raising boys who'd learn to fish the same creek we did." He didn't say more, didn't need to. Tessa nodded, returning her attention to the next row. "I thought I might marry by 20, she said. "But then Pa got sick and everything waited. After he passed, it never felt like the right time." Micah stood slowly. "Is it time now?" She looked up again, and this time her eyes didn't waver. "It might be." He held out a hand. She took it, and he helped her to her feet. Later that evening, they sat on the porch, the last light fading behind the hills. Tessa had brought out a tin of dried apple slices, and they passed it back and forth, chewing in silence. "I saw a man in town today," she said, "wearing a Union coat, though it was patched over in places. He had a limp." Micah nodded once. "That'd be Caleb Dorr. He's got a homestead near the river, lost half his company in Tennessee. He looked like he was carrying ghosts." "Most of us are," Micah said. "Difference is whether they run you or not." She looked down at her hands. "I don't feel haunted anymore. I did for a long time, but not since here." Micah reached over, resting his hand atop hers. "You brought something back with you, not just for yourself." She turned her palm upward, fingers curling into his. "You gave me space to plant it." The wind stirred the dry grass past the porch, and somewhere nearby a whippoorwill called once, then again. "You think the garden will take?" she asked. "I do," he said. "Might not come up perfect, but I think it'll grow." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he settled his arm around her. In the quiet, the promise between them didn't need speaking. It was in the warmth of their joined hands, in the scent of tilled earth, in the way her body fit against his as if it had always belonged there. And when the stars came out, slow and certain, neither of them moved. By early June, the cottonwoods along the creek had leafed out thick and green, and the last of the snowmelt had settled into a steady trickle through the shallow bends. Micah led the wagon down the narrow track past the edge of town, reins loose in his hands, while Tessa sat beside him with a basket on her lap and a folded blanket tucked at her feet. "Didn't expect you to agree to a day off," she said as they turned toward the meadow that sloped gently eastward, full of wild rye and tall buttercups. "I didn't," he said, glancing at her. "I agreed to your terms, which included baked bread, no badge, and not a single person shouting my name before dusk." She smiled at that, tucking a loose strand of hair beneath her hat. "Well, I brought the bread, and I left the badge behind." The wagon rolled to a stop beneath a cottonwood whose limbs reached out wide like an old man stretching after sleep. Tessa stepped down first, skirts lifted clear of the grass, and began laying out the blanket while Micah tied the reins and checked the harness. Once settled, they ate in quiet, passing slices of bread spread with blackberry preserves and a jar of pickled carrots she traded for at the mercantile. The sun climbed higher, warm but not heavy, and a breeze moved through the grass like a whisper. Micah leaned back on his elbows. "You remember what you told me that first night, about not having anywhere to go?" Tessa looked over at him, her expression steady. "I do." "Is that still true?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she lay down beside him, folding her hands over her stomach and looking up through the branches overhead. "No," she said finally. "Now I do." He turned to study her face, the way her mouth softened at the corners when she was thinking. "Where is it, here?" she said. "With you." The wind swept through the grass again, and a bird called from somewhere high above. Micah reached for her hand, and she laced her fingers through his without hesitation. "I've been thinking," he said, voice low, "about building on to the cabin, just a room or two, enough for what might come." She turned her head toward him. "You mean for students?" "Or something else." He met her gaze. "Something else, if you want it." Tessa sat up slowly, brushing her fingers across the blanket's edge. "I never thought I'd get asked like this, out under the trees with pickled carrots and crumbs in my lap." He sat up too. "I didn't think I'd ever ask." She studied him for a long moment, then reached up to touch his cheek, her thumb brushing the line of his jaw. "Yes, Micah, I want it." They returned late, with the sun pressing low and golden against the edge of the hills. That night, Tessa brought out her quilt pieces and spread them across the table. Micah helped move the oil lamp closer, and together they arranged the squares into a pattern no two fabrics alike, but fitting all the same. "I want to finish this before September," she said, pinning two corners together. "If I'm going to be teaching, I won't have time for sewing." "You'll make time," he said. "You always do." She leaned into his side and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "Do you think folks will talk?" she asked. "About us living together before it's written proper, they might," he said. "But that's not what we're doing." She looked up at him. He nodded once, certain. "There's a traveling judge coming through next week," he said. "We'll speak to him." Tessa's smile was quiet but sure. "I'll wear my Sunday dress." That Saturday, they stood in the small room beside the church, hands joined before the judge with only Mrs. Kendry and the blacksmith's wife to witness. Tessa's dress was pale green with a row of buttons down the back, and Micah wore the coat he'd kept folded in a chest since Kansas. They said their vows with the windows open to let in birdsong and the scent of lilacs. When it was done, Micah bent to kiss her, and Tessa gripped his lapels like she'd never let go. They moved through summer with the rhythm of shared days, Tessa writing lesson plans in the evenings, Micah tending to town business and bringing in the last of the firewood before the first frost. The cabin grew with the addition of 2 rooms, one for teaching supplies and books, the other left bare but for a cradle Micah carved with his own hands, sanded smooth and lined with the softest cloth Tessa could find. In October, the school bell rang for the first time in 3 years. Tessa stood at the front of the room, chalk in hand, while 12 children filed in and took their seats. Micah waited outside until the last of them had gone in, then lingered by the window just long enough to see her smile as she began. Years passed, measured not in seasons but in the quiet marks of a life built steady as stone, the garden that returned each spring, the children who outgrew the classroom and still waved to her in town, the soft weight of a daughter cradled in Tessa's arms one winter morning while snow fell silent across the roof. They grew older together, not all at once, but in the slow way days stitched themselves into decades. And through it all, the laughter, the worry, the grief that came once or twice but never stayed, there was a steadiness between them that needed no words. Micah never left Rawlins, and Tessa never had reason to. Their home stood with its porch facing east, catching the first light of every new day, the kind of light that falls only on what's been earned and what lasts.